One of the more interesting figures of the 20th century, you could have to say, is Archbishop Thuc. Over the course of the 19th century, and then 20th century, and now 21st century, Catholicism has very firmly established itself in the life of Vietnam. And there are very many devout Vietnamese Catholics, and even though they're persecuted by the current communist government, they are a very educated elite. When France left South Vietnam and the entirety of the country, and South Vietnam was established as an independent country, Ngo Diem became its president until he was overthrown in a military coup in 1963. Diem ruled by giving powerful positions to members of his family. One such member of his family was Archbishop Thuc, the Archbishop of Hue, Vietnam. His brother was assassinated in a coup in 1963 during the Second Vatican Council, and that meant Archbishop Thuc was essentially stuck outside of his country for the rest of his life in exile permanently. In exile, he consecrated a number of traditionalists, one of them founding their own independent religion, the Palmerists, some of them simply being old Catholics who took their orders to continue their mission of streaming, and 3 of them forming a new religion of Sedevecantism. So I read Edward Jarvis, who is a historian of religion, his book Sedevacante, The Life and Legacy of Archbishop Thuc, which goes over not just Archbishop Thuc's life as a biography. It talks somewhat about Sedevacantism, but the majority is, of course, about Archbishop Thuc. And what he does very intelligently in this book is he takes Thuc and puts him within the stream of independent Catholicism, or old Catholicism, if you will. Generally, people that view themselves as Western Christians and Catholics, but not connected to Rome. Now, there's a great deal of independent Catholics throughout the world. There's, in fact, millions, if not tens of millions of these people. Many of them are centered in Latin America and the Philippines. What we call Old Catholicism today is this very small minority religion, which broke off during the First Vatican Council and now is a very, very liberal version of Roman Catholicism. That's actually a very small minority. The majority of them, of course, are what you could simply call independent Catholics, who are from the most liberal, sometimes even there's Gnostic independent Catholics who openly take Gnostic positions, read the found Gnostic scriptures as legitimate scripture, to Sedevacantism, the most conservative version of Catholicism, air quotes, because I believe there's only one true Catholic Church that there is. As for Jarvis's book itself, I liked it, but the scholarship is kind of spotty. His choice of secondary resources, which he uses to describe the Diem regime, is pretty bad. The resource in question is Background to Betrayal, the Tragedy of Vietnam by Hilaire du Barrier. It was published in 1965, and that's on the heels of the collapse of the Nago family. It comes across as very heavy-handed and a very biased account of the regime. It seems polemical, exaggerated, and transparently political, and it's a criticism of then current American policy in Southeast Asia. It provides one very absurd claim, which is that Thuc thought that he could leverage his influence through his brother's presidency in order to become pope. Of course, the person who originally used this source to describe Archbishop Thuc was Father Shikata in his article, 2 Bishops in Every Garage. It goes without saying, while Father Shikata is a very easy source to use for studying Sedevacantism, he's very questionable. He may be articulate, but I find him to be generally untrustworthy and prideful, especially when he glosses over the history of the traditional movement to paint out his own heroes and villains. Before leaving the Society of St. Pius V, he was a very vehemently anti-Thuc bishop. Or he's very vehement in his opposition to the Thuc bishops. And now he's completely switched sides and is the greatest supporter for the Thuc bishops. If you're going to find stuff to defend the validity of the Thuc consecrations, it's usually things written by him, and he personally assists Bishop Dolan, who's a Thuc bishop. Something which also plagues Jarvis's work actually is racism. and I know that's going to sound weird that I'm saying that, but it's true. He often asserts something which is contrary to all my personal experience, and that which is that Christianity cannot be translated from culture to culture. To him, Asian Christianity retains the exteriors of the sacraments or the structures of the Western Church, but remains essentially a local indigenous religion underneath. A sort of religious Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I understand that Asians may baptize Confucius instead of Aristotle, but to say that classical theism can never be understood by Asians because of cultural differences is insulting. Well, yes, the pre-existing indigenous religions and philosophy of every culture in some sense shapes the Christianity which exists there. To say that it's a completely different religion and that Christians from different cultures don't truly operate under the same faith is contrary to both observation and reason. Overall, though, the book does provide a viable resource and gives information which is often very difficult to come by in a pretty fast to read 160 odd pages. Some of the stuff in this book previously took me hours and hours combing through old traditional Catholic chat boards on GeoCities sites to find. His prose is very good, and even if he seems to be heavy-handed in his bias against the Diem regime and Thuc's hand within it, he's fairly generous and charitable when discussing the religious views of those involved. He treats Thuc's later years in context of which makes sense, and notes to the reader the level of alienization and lack of content which Thuc found himself in exile, and how that would have influenced his actions and worldview. Like I said before, to be blunt, Archbishop Thuc is one of the most interesting men of the 20th century. He not only served a key role in the foundation of South Vietnam, but once exiled from said regime wound up being a key figure in founding of multiple cults and provided the holy orders for Sedevecantism. So to a certain extent, his role in South Vietnam is boring and uninteresting actually compared to his later life. His brother was a right-wing dictator, Ngo Diem, who ran Vietnam from his creation until the United States overthrew him. The Ngo family are similar to the Assad family. They are running a country through the use of an educated elite religious minority. Instead of Alawites ruling over the Sunnis, it was Catholics ruling over Buddhists. The Ngo family was as corrupt as any Southeast Asian government, but they provided too heavy discrimination of the native Buddhists majority and gave Catholics too many privileges for the United States to take a blind eye. And as a result, they were overthrown in a coup in November 1963, while Thuc, then the Archbishop of Hue, was president at the Second Vatican Council. His life was spared, while his family was slaughtered, and he was left in exile forever. Something which is often brought up about Thuc is that before Vatican II, and indeed within it, he appeared to be quite progressive, theologically and liturgically, advocating for a radical change of the Mass within his home country in favor of native cultural customs, calling for non-Christians to attend Vatican II, identifying both as a Confucian and Catholic simultaneously, calling for greater participation of women in the Mass. Yet after the council, he consecrated a number of traditional men. These men that he consecrated in the bishops were in varying widely in their worthiness, and he took almost no preparation beforehand in order to do it. He simply did it on a dime. Whenever someone within the traditional movement approached him asking for holy orders, he simply did it. This included 5 men who then formed the Palmer de Troyes cult, 3 Sedevacantists, an unspecified number of reconsecrations of men who received old Catholic orders. At the same time, he celebrated the Novus Ordo Mass and confession. Then, reconciling with the church and dying in a monastery made up of Vietnamese refugee priests and religious brothers in the United States. This is really bizarre behavior. So bizarre that the Society of St. Pius V has separated itself from the rest of Sedevacantism out of fear of being contaminated by the Thuc bishops. I think it serves more or less as a mortal blow to the cause of Sedevacantism, showing that they don't have divine providence. Why did Thuc do this? Did he have dementia? Was it simony? Did he do it in order to survive as a bankrupt refugee? Did he actually become a Sedevacantist? Was he wreaking vengeance on the Vatican for leaving him for dead? Did he suffer from survivor's guilt syndrome and was trying to atone to God? Was he trying to regain some semblance of his lost power? We don't know, but I think his opponents make him worse than he actually was in retrospect. He underwent 3 apocalypses in his life: the destruction and conquest of his home country, the annihilation of his family, and the chaos of the Second Vatican Council, which is ongoing to this day. He was alienated and completely left for dead, had no countrymen nor family to provide him company. Many who were liberal before the council became conservative afterwards. A number of priests left the priesthood and married, believing that a married priesthood and even episcopacy was imminent before Sacerdalius Catabaltus, Paul VI encyclical on priestly celibacy. Sometimes these marriages would fail. Priests would then become independent traditional priests. This even included a bishop, Mario Retino Cronjolo Raviero from Peru, who eventually became a consecrator of French traditionalist priests, some of which I believe are Sedevacantists, and would mean that he, a married bishop who returned to traditional Catholicism, is the third line of Sedevacantist bishops. All that being said, it's interesting how much the shadow of Archbishop Lefebvre looms over traditional Catholicism as a whole. It would come as a surprise to Catholics that across the Christian world, being liturgically conservative isn't necessarily a close correlation with being theologically, morally, socially, scripturally, or politically conservative. Anglican and Old Catholic priestesses will often offer high church or even Latin masses, then give sermons regarding the need for tolerance towards homosexuals. While this is generally not true within Catholicism, the opposite can be. Many traditionalists will be surprised or even disturbed by the orthodoxy of charismatics and modernized masses. That being said, Thuc was probably theologically traditional, but generally ambivalent towards liturgy. Seeing Catholic France, Spain, and Italy disintegrate before his eyes, the only ones that had answers in this chaos of Vatican II probably appeared to be the traditionalists. So he joined them to a lesser or greater extent. But that leaves the question, why wasn't he so choosy when he did make these consecrations? According to some Sedevacantist defenders, Thuc personally believed that when he was made papal legate by Pius XI, he was given express power to select and consecrate bishops. And this may have even have occurred because Pius XI envisioned that the coming Second World War would cut Vietnam off from Rome for a prolonged period. Jarvis points to the apparent flimsiness of this argument on numerous occasions throughout the book. He particularly addresses how Sedevacantists use this to justify continuing to administer sacraments, particularly confession and marriage, despite the extinction of ordinary jurisdiction in the, 62 years since the death of Pius XII? I would venture to say that Thuc actually did believe this. He must have personally believed it and told it to those he consecrated in order to get around the cognitive dissonance of his actions. Once viewed in this light, it makes sense that he would consecrate as many men as possible and across the wide spectrum of traditionalism. He also was grasping onto it as the last vestiges of his power as a bishop, and was able to make friends and connections while doing it, exercising some of his lost power and alleviating his deep loneliness. Like I said, he was a Vietnamese person, a very high-ranking Vietnamese person, who was no longer a bishop, who was poor and abandoned in France. The only way that he can make friends is through his faith. In retrospective, it's very easy to laugh at Palmer de Troya until you bump into a Medjugorje follower after Mass. While the outcome might be different, the principle remains the same. An unapproved Marian apparition can't be shut down by the local church. The apparition ends, but visionaries remain. The visionaries then attack the local church, and massive amounts of donations are funneled into beautiful cathedrals. Clemente Dominguez y Gomez, once condemned, formed his own sect in the same way the Medjugorje, to a certain extent, has formed its own sect. The difference is the Catholic Church learned after Palmer de Troya. It didn't follow the same steps that it follows with Medjugorje. So Medjugorje exists in this sort of limbo state. The Catholic Church hopes that it'll just go off into nothing and it'll be forgotten and it'll die off. But Medjugorje right now is where Palmer de Troya was in 1975. Thuc's consecrations gave them the power and their legitimacy to become a full-fledged cult 3 years later. As for the reordination of traditional Catholics, who illicitly obtain orders through Catholic means, if there is no pope, what are you supposed to say? There would be no authority to excommunicate or punish those who have illegal holy orders. They are going to celebrate Mass and lead congregations anyway. It's better to at least make sure that they have valid holy orders. Then, of course, he consecrated the Sedevacantist. I deeply doubt he ever was a Sedevacantist in any real or meaningful sense. Merely that he ordained any traditionalist to ask for orders, whether they be a visionary or a Sedevacantist. As for a proclamation on the vacancy of the Holy See, who knows? Does it really matter? He got attention, importance, and felt like he was helping the church, at least in some fashion. And again, to return to his reconsecration of the old Catholic bishops, in the wake of Vatican II, there were a lot of people that were running around, say priests or laymen, that didn't have sacraments to administer in the traditional rites. So these priests would eventually get old and die if they were never to become bishops. So what did they do? They went into the old Catholic world and became priests and bishops. One such case, the CMRI, and they became a cult too, at least for a period. Why would the old Catholics do this? Because the old Catholics have deregulated their orders so much, you can essentially buy or even ask for them for free. It's to the extent that somebody like Pope Michael, who is completely laughable, is now a legitimate bishop because he has asked for another independent Catholic to consecrate him. And regarding that, the mass proliferation of holy orders within the network of independent Catholicism, when anyone picks and chooses multiple men solely under their own authority to consecrate bishops, not with any agreement with any ecclesiastical polity, or under their God-given power as the Pope, it's only a matter of time before an unstable man attains the episcopate. These unstable men will spread it far and wide, as happened with Arnold Matthew, Carlos Duterte Costa? I'm really bad at pronouncing names. I'm sorry, guys. I'm really trying. I know who these people are, but I can't pronounce the names at all. Anyway, Emmanuel Milgago. And so has happened as well with Archbishop Thuc. Through them, a whole world of wackiness known as the independent sacramental movement has formed. So let's address the Sedevacantist as a movement from a non-Catholic perspective, but from a sociological and comparative religious perspective. To the average layperson, the controversy of the flawed descent of holy orders between a man like Thuc is not a problem. Only the Society of St. Pius V threatening to break up marriages and families over it is. Even if there are secret consecrations behind closed doors by a non-Sedevacantist bishop, is just as questionable as any of the lineages of the Thuc bishops. Truly, the Society of St. Pius V, if Thuc was a victim of elder abuse, then Mendez was also a victim of elder abuse. And the Society of St. Pius V's holy orders are just as questionable as the Thuc's holy orders. That being said, from my understanding, the Vatican does recognize the Thuc holy orders, as well as the Society of St. Pius X. Anyway, returning to Sedevacantism, it was first established in Mexico, but due to the instability of that country, it jumped borders of the United States and has become firmly established there. With most new religious movements, they have this initial charismatic period, and they transform into cults but they don't have a second successor charismatic period. But some of them stabilize. Most new religions have this initial, cult that forms of this charismatic period, this initial charismatic leader, and when he dies, the whole thing collapses in on itself. But in certain religions, so let's say Mormonism, we'll use Mormonism as an example, one charismatic leader succeeded by a second charismatic leader. And that transition period actually established it as a legitimate religion. So, the third person in line in Mormonism is not necessarily as charismatic, but that huge area, these two successors, was able to firmly establish as a religion, the transfer of power. So Sedevecantism never really ran into this, and now it's essentially established denomination, or established new Christian religion. That being said, Sedevecantism actually has a pretty bright future in terms of growth. They're very, very pro-natalist, so they're going to grow a lot through births and marriages. And their legitimacy, while lacking under, Paul VI, John Paul II, and then the 16th, has grown and will continue to grow as long as Francis remains the Pope, or if you have a successor like him, meaning that some Catholics will convert to it, and if it grows big enough, even non-Catholics will convert to it. They will grow explosively and possibly spread throughout the Anglophone and as well as the Hispanophone. They will eventually outgrow the various versions of Old Catholicism and number in the hundreds of thousands by the end of the century. Sedevacantists provide a potent threat to the authority and legitimacy of the Catholic Church. Because of both their disproportionate birth rates, they are much younger than the institutional church and able to spread their message through modern media with a greater virulence than their size would suggest. That being said, their primary danger comes not out of conversion, growth, or even legitimacy. It comes from their arguments. I've seen a lot of confessional Lutherans and Eastern Orthodox and other denominations read up on Sedevacantism, then use their own arguments as a general rule and argue against the papacy itself. Sedevacantists have become much more dangerous as a sword than as sword wielders. Unless if the Catholic Church develops a proper apologetics against them, other denominations will use their arguments with great power against the Catholic Church itself. That being said, on his legacy, hopefully Archbishop Thuc, because he returned to the church and lived in a monastery with Franciscan Vietnamese exiles in the last months of his life, hopefully he has went to purgatory and heaven. Please pray for his soul and pray for the reunification of Sedevacantists to the main, true, and eternal Catholic Church.